So the interesting point that I see with a lot of people that I've even been talking to during sort of the last couple of years, as we know what it was, and even talking to now, is that they think that it's going to be the same as it is today forever. So look at the property growth that we saw over the last couple of years, and everyone's like, oh my gosh, this is just going to keep going crazy. But then when they looking at it, like, hey, wait, it changed? Like, what do you mean things aren't always going to be the same as they are today? Like, this is one of those kind of biases, I'll call them, where people will just say, this is how it's going to stay. Like, have you sort of faced this yourself, where you have made decisions thinking that things are going to stay the same as they are today?
So I would make the argument on all the points we're going to talk about, nothing today, on the ones we're going to talk about today anyhow, this is the point that has made me the most money. I would say that something I have been excelled at, something that's helped me a lot, is I've been very, very good at spotting trends and things that I think are going to change and then going all in on them before other people. And I'll give you some examples. When I started my marketing agency, how I actually developed we'll call it an edge or significant advantage, is I was one of the first people to use Philippines talent. So while everyone else was paying people, let's say 80 grand a year to do these roles, I was able to outsource and offshore that labor at about a third the cost. So for every one person someone had locally with an office and everything else that went with it, I had 3.
Yeah.
And why that was so significant is I was able to go into, I was looking at this and going, the internet's getting better, the language barriers and cultural barriers are changing, like the world is becoming globalized. I think I'm going to be able to train offshore people to a level where we're going to be able to be substantially cheaper, and that's going to be my edge. I'll go into these accounts and say, I'll run your account for half of what this other agency is doing, and that's how it can work. And it worked. And there was this whole idea at the time, like, oh, you couldn't possibly outsource this stuff. You need a Melbourne office, right? So you can imagine, and do you know what? I had to hide we were using outsourced labor because people were like we laugh today. Like, everyone uses outsourced labor. It's like, oh, you got a VA? Of course you got a VA. You're an idiot if you don't have a VA.
Yeah.
But at that time, that was such like contrarian and different thinking. So that that way of thinking about things served me very well, to the point where the second business I ended up in, as I said, was like BPO and recruitment because everyone got on the board on this. So I spotted that trend really well. Bringing this to investing though, and the other side of the fence is like, it's funny when I talk to my mum about certain suburbs and how she thinks about them. So there's a suburb, I'm trying to remember what it is, Northcote in Victoria. And she's like, oh, it was a bit rough around there growing up. I'm like, I don't think I can afford to look at the houses in Northcote. It's trendy and hipster, and of course I joke when I say that, but can you see that her psychology and belief is like, if you grow up in an area, you think it's going to be like that forever. That's your interpretation of it. So like, and I'm sure in every state, and I think there's an area in Queensland, Logan, which is, and I think that's a region where it's like you watch people get fired up about it, or Frankston in Victoria is another one, where there's all these suburbs where we've got this belief that, oh, it was rough there once, it'll be rough there forever. And one of the things that's actually served me very well is I bought in an area that had a bad stigma, and then it went through that gentrification process, and like I made a killing because everyone else thought not to buy there. Another really good example of this is when the, we'll call it the, what do they call it? I don't think you're allowed to call it the Big C anymore.
Just call it Big C. We'll go
Big
with that.
C, the endeavors of the last few years that would leave us to stay in our homes.
That one.
I think people know what I'm talking about now. Something you might put something over your face for like this. Anyway, just trying not to get flagged by the YouTube algorithm here. Nonetheless, is when that first broke out, how many people like, the world is going to end. It's all over. Yeah, so I think I've spoken about this on the podcast before. One of the best investments I've ever made is when that first happened, I actually bought a property in New South Wales. And what's funny is we offered $100,000 below what they were asking, and they didn't even counter.
See, they're going, damn, I should have offered less.
I should have. And then over the next few years, so just imagine this. Let's pretend the property was $1 million. I offered them 900,000. They accepted it instantly and wanted a quick settlement. So probably could, because if you thought the world is ending, of course you want to offload this thing as quick as possible. Yep. And then we went on to have 2 really strong years in that area, and I made a significant investment return, really, I should say there. So they're just different examples of how people think things are going to stay a certain way and they don't. And that every time that I've been able to kind of capture some of that, I've got I won't even say it's more than significant gain. They are my most successful investments, has been when I've been able to capture something that I believe is going to change in the world and then go in on it. It's almost like contrarian views or counter-cyclical views.
Where you're looking at the opposite.
I'll bet it's the same for you though. Look into your own situations where you've had significant wins, not okay wins, but you likely were seeing something other people didn't because they were assuming things were going to stay as they are.
And to that point, I'm also seeing things now. I was talking on the weekend, I caught up with my grandma and my parents. And one of the interesting points, I'm like, I think the market's going through this new bench of $1 million. So in Melbourne and Sydney, oh my gosh, I can't believe things are now $1 million in certain suburbs and stuff, right? And majority of these inner suburbs, everyone's like,
which suburb in Melbourne isn't $1 million now? It's ridiculous.
But and then everyone's like, this is crazy. I'm like, no, that's you assuming that things should always be how they used to be. So I was talking to my parents and grandma, and they fell off their chair when inner sort of city places went above $100,000. They're like, this is ridiculous. This is going to drop down. This is not normal. And I'm like, you notice that's just you thinking that things were always going to be the same way.
Well, Graham, why is every Australian entitled to own a house?
Yeah.
Where did this come from? Maybe we're going to end up like Europe, where most people don't own houses.
And they rent.
Yeah, so if you're sitting there feeling like things are going to stay the same, you're entitled to own a house in Australia, maybe that changes.
And I always look at this as the luck versus risk factor, right? So, and it actually overlaps a little bit with number one, that personal bias. Sure, you could have lucked it and you could have won with something and going, if I do that again, I'm going to win again because that's the way things always are. When in actual fact, no. So to your point around business, so I lent in to offshore staff very early as well. Which
I would argue the reason we're both successful is we lent into the internet early.
Yeah, super early. And so I was doing SEO when there weren't that many other companies doing SEO. And
I was butchering SEO when there wasn't that many SEO companies.
I was butchering paid ads. Don't you worry. You can get better returns on SEO. It's like putting money in a bank and it paying interest out. It's better than ads, where ads you always it's pay to play. You stop paying, you stop playing. Don't worry. Well, so I lent in so hard that I actually found that I'm like, the better way for me to scale this business is just bloody move to the Philippines. So I moved to the Philippines where my staff were. And now I didn't force them into the office at the time and stuff like that, but I'm just like, this is a trend that I'm going to be able to lean into. And to this day, I still talk to people a lot about culture and how to work with offshore staff and things like that. But the interesting thing, not to sort of relay a very similar story, was actually at the end of when I stopped doing SEO. So I started having a lot of friends who were very successful at SEO, and I said, this trend of profitability is going to stop. I'm like, this is a commodity now. There is no skill. People don't understand what they're buying. They don't understand good versus bad providers and things like that. This is just there, and there's 1 million people offering the same service. You need to build a better business model because the heydays are done. And so I spoke to quite a few friends of mine, and quite a few of them are actually doing very well about saying, okay, well, take your skills and focus them internally. Build your own assets and sort of make your money off your own assets, not trying to make money in a flooded market. This is the whole blue ocean versus red ocean kind of concept. And so that was me going, well, things aren't always going to be the same, where people are coming into this market going, oh my gosh, there's so much money to be made here. And I'm like, no. So prices went down, profit margins went down. Every time you're talking to people, it was always like, how can it be cheaper? And I can get there's an Indian person that's just pinged me and it's so much cheaper, etc. And looking at that going, okay, well, things just aren't always going to be the same. Where is that next opportunity? What is the thing that's coming down the line that I should be looking at? Which is, to your point, kind of counter-cyclical in the sense that, well, that's not what everybody was doing. Everyone was turning into single SEO providers, like just one-man bands being an SEO provider with some offshore staff. And I'm like, yeah, it's just too many people stepping into that. So that was one of the main things that I'm just like, just can't base your decisions now of thinking that everything's always going to be the same way.
I'll share an insight here that I, again, learned through some of the training I did. I remember like I was sitting down with one of my mentors and he explained something to me. He's like, everything happens in cycles. Or seasons was the word he used. So he's like, the weather's got seasons. Your body will go through seasons. Like, being a kid is very different than being a teenager. Being a teenager is very different than when you're in your 20s and so on. Like before having kids and after having kids, having elderly parents, being a grandparent, like there's all these different cycles and stages of life you're going to go through and change. And he goes, don't you see that your psychology is broken? Because if you think things are going to be the same and you're not acknowledging like biology,
the whole chain,
the weather, like it's like counter. Like you think that today is how it's always going to be. And like it's very interesting when you start to look at the world like that. Businesses have cycles. Like businesses existed 100 years ago are very different than businesses existed today.
Fundamentally.
Yeah, so that's something to tap into and use to your advantage, not something to ignore.
Hey, fellow business owner, if this topic and value-packed short video has resonated with you at all, and you want to dive deeper into being a full stack business owner, check out the full episode by clicking the link on your screen or in the description right now.